Hi, I'm Gary Burnett. Welcome to Philippians in 10, a series of talks where we're going to explore the Apostle Paul's letter to the Philippians in just 10 minutes per episode. I hope we'll find it interesting, but more than that, encouraging, inspiring, and maybe a little bit challenging. In this first episode, we want to get a feel for this wonderful little letter, understand a little of the background so that we can appreciate all the good stuff that we will unpack in subsequent episodes. It's a wonderful letter. I've been teaching Paul for many years. It's maybe my favourite letter. Well, it's short, which is never a bad thing. It's Paul at his most positive. It's got this amazing section often called the Christ hymn in chapter 2. And it sparkles with joy. That's what one New Testament scholar says in the first sentence of his commentary on the letter. This joy, he says, is the sort of life-giving, heart-refreshing joy that is tangibly transforming in its effects on the mundane realities of life. Doesn't that immediately make you want to read the letter? Here we are surrounded by bad news, war, famine, flooding, economic turmoil, and maybe difficult circumstances in our own lives. But here are 4 chapters of the New Testament that can give us the sort of joy that can transform our lives. Now, just as an aside, why don't you take time to read the whole letter in just one sitting? It might take you about 15-20 minutes. Maybe get somebody to read it aloud to you, because that's the way the Philippians would have encountered the letter. Most people in the Mediterranean world of the first century were illiterate, and it's likely that very few in the Philippian church would have been able to read. So they gathered together, they had the letter read out to them. Have a go at that yourself and listen to what Paul has to say. So in this letter there's joy. There's a wonderful description of what God is like, what Christ is like. There's thankfulness, and there's a lot about God's people being united. But more than that, Paul is doing something quite remarkable. He's remapping the Philippians' universe. He's reorientating their whole way of thinking, equipping them to shine like stars in their world. He's remapping their universe. And if we let it, our universe too can be remapped. We too can be equipped to shine like stars in our world. So in these talks, we're going to see just how Paul does that. First of all, though, let's think about Paul's situation and the situation in Philippi. Paul wrote this letter when he was in prison. Exactly where and when, we can't be sure. It could have been Ephesus, Caesarea, maybe Rome. The main thing is that he's writing from prison. Now, Roman prisons were not pleasant places. From what Paul says in the letter, he was in fetters, most likely chained to his guard. He mentions these chains 3 times in chapter 1. The toilet arrangements were basic. The smells would have been awful. And he'd have been reliant on friends for food and water. And in fact, the Philippians had sent Epaphroditus to tend to him, to minister to my needs, as he puts it in chapter 3. And that's one of the reasons that Paul writes to this church. He wants to thank them for Epaphroditus and the gifts that they had sent him. You can read about that in chapter 4 of the letter. So Paul is in prison in pretty dire circumstances. Not only that, he's not sure how things are going to work out. From what he says in chapter 1:19 onwards, Paul knows he could be facing execution. He remains hopeful of being released, but he's come face to face with the solemn reality that he could end up being killed. Can you imagine what this would have been like? In jail, in fetters, in unhygienic, smelly conditions, dependent on visitors for your meals, and facing the reality that this might all end with the executioner's sword. It was a pretty tough situation. But he's grateful for the support that this little church at Philippi has provided. There's probably only 15 to 100 of them. Acts 16 tells us that the church began when Paul arrived in the city and spread the gospel to a merchant woman called Lydia and others. And then he and Silas fell foul of the authorities when they interfered with the city commerce by exorcising a slave girl diviner, and they ended up in jail. So it was a church born out of conflict and opposition, but nevertheless it seems to have thrived. Paul and the Philippians remain close, and he thanks them for their partnership, more so than any other church, providing for his needs when he went on to Thessalonica, and now sending aid when they heard he was in prison. I want us to think about the way in which the Philippians supported Paul, because this was a group of people that was not well off. This was a world very unlike our own Western societies. There was no middle class, no social security system, no opportunities for social mobility. There were small numbers of people who were the Roman elite, and the vast majority of people were either just about getting by or seriously struggling. And at least 20% of the population were enslaved. Life was tough for ordinary people in cities like Philippi. It was likely if your children got sick, they would die in infancy. And if you got sick, there were no doctors, and you too might die. Having enough food and clothing was often a problem, and violence could erupt at a moment's notice. Disasters like fire breaking out or epidemic spreading were all hazards to be coped with. Life was hard, brutish, and short. From what we know about Philippi in the first century, we can have an educated guess at what the church looked like. There would have been some freed slaves, some craftspeople, some small shopkeepers, some quarry and farm workers, and then some slaves and people who were really, really poor. All of these people were not at all well off. Paul himself, writing to the Corinthians, talked about the Philippians' extreme poverty and severe suffering. And yet, they supported Paul in his ministry and his imprisonment. They were generous. Paul told the Corinthians about the Philippians' wealth of generosity and how they gave beyond their means. And in his letter to them, he commends them for sharing with him in his troubles. And from what Paul says at the end of chapter 1, the Philippians themselves are having a hard time because of people opposing them. They're suffering, experiencing the same sort of conflict, Paul says, that he had faced. And you remember that when Paul was in Philippi, he ended up in jail. When I was teaching in a Bible college in India a wee while ago, there were 2 young women in the class. Their entire family had had to move from a town about 100 miles away because the father had become a Christian. He'd been a Muslim, he had owned a shop, but once his community heard that he had become a Christian, his business dropped overnight. The family was forced to relocate. That's very likely to have been the sort of situation in Philippi, where neighbours became very suspicious of people they thought were no longer honouring the gods. This was a very superstitious world. People tried to ward off danger and harm by placating the gods. You went to the temple, you burned a little incense, or left some grain or wine, just hoped it would be enough to keep your family and neighbourhood safe. Imagine now your neighbour starting to worship some strange god from faraway Israel, saying he was the only God and that all these other gods were useless. You really didn't want to have anything to do with them. You stopped buying goods from them. You didn't employ them. And suddenly things got very tough for the Jesus followers. Life, which was already on the edge, suddenly got very precarious. So that's the backdrop to Paul's letter to the Philippians. It's written from a man in a desperate situation to people under extreme pressure. And yet, as we read the letter, it's full of hope. Paul is hopeful about his own situation. He's hopeful for the Philippian situation and is full of joy, somehow against all the odds, in the most desperate of circumstances. Paul says, I rejoice and share my joy with you all. And he encourages them to rejoice in the Lord always. And is full of thankfulness, Paul, for the fact that God is at work even in his imprisonment, and thankful for Epaphroditus' visit, and thankful for the Philippian support. Hope, joy, thankfulness, generosity, all in the midst of the most terrible circumstances. It doesn't make much sense, really, does it? How can you be glad, rejoice, be hopeful, give generously, and remain thankful in the midst of life's troubles? Well, that's why I'm suggesting that Paul is remapping the universe for the Philippians. Something in the world has changed. Roman jails and ill-tempered neighbours and hard times are not the last word. The centre of this letter is chapter 2 with its description of Christ, his humility, his lordship over everything, and that's why things have changed. That's why the current trials are not the last word, why it's possible to have hope and joy and be thankful and generous. We'll discover more of this in future episodes, but for now, here's the encouragement and the challenge for us. Christ has risen, he's Lord of all, and as Paul says in chapter 4 of this letter, he's near. Can we begin to focus on that reality and begin to let the joy and the hope of that seep through and begin to be thankful and generous, even in the midst of troubled times?